25 of the world's most brilliant minds walked into the room, and 25 walked out in failure. The stakes, the entire Moretti empire. The problem? A cryptographic lock designed by a dead genius that no supercomputer could crack. Alessandro Moretti was ready to burn the world down in frustration. He didn't notice the girl sweeping the floor in the corner, a girl invisible to everyone. But while the experts argued over algorithms, she saw what they missed. In exactly 60 seconds, the poor maid didn't just open the safe, she unlocked a dangerous obsession that would change the underworld forever. The air in the library of the Moretti estate tasted like expensive scotch and desperate failure. It was a room designed to intimidate, with ceiling-high bookshelves filled with unread classics, heavy velvet drapes that shut out the Italian sun, and a massive mahogany desk that served as the throne for Alessandro Moretti. Alessandro stood by the window, his back to the room. He was a man composed of sharp angles and colder silences, wearing a charcoal three-piece suit that cost more than most people earned in a decade. He was the capo of the most feared syndicate in New York, a man who could dismantle a rival organization with a single phone call. But right now, he was helpless. "It's impossible, Mr. Moretti," the voice behind him stammered. It belonged to Dr. Arthur Sterling, a cryptographer from MIT who had spent the last 6 hours sweating through his tweed jacket. "The permutations, they don't follow a logical sequence. It's chaos, pure chaos." Alessandro turned slowly. His eyes were the color of gunmetal, and right now they were narrowed in disgust. "Chaos," Alessandro repeated, his voice smooth and dangerous, like a razor blade wrapped in silk. "My father, the late Don Moretti, was many things. A murderer, a thief, a visionary. But he was never chaotic. You are the 25th expert I have flown in this month, Dr. Sterling. You come with commendations from the NSA. And you are telling me that a mechanical box from 1985 has beaten you." On the desk sat the object of their torment. It looked innocuous enough, a heavy matte black steel cube, roughly the size of a jewelry box. On its face were 5 rotating dials, not with numbers, but with strange etched symbols: a raven, a fractured tower, a weeping eye, a dagger, and a rose. It was the Pandora mechanism, a failsafe left by Alessandro's father. Inside lay the ledger that contained the locations of the family's offshore billions, money Alessandro needed immediately to fend off a hostile takeover by the rival Bratva syndicate. "I need more time," Sterling pleaded, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "The tactile feedback on the tumblers is misleading. It changes every time I touch it. It's rigged to jam if the wrong sequence is entered even partially." "Dominic," Alessandro said softly. Dominic, Alessandro's massive head of security, stepped out of the shadows. He looked like a boulder carved into the shape of a man, his face a map of old scars. "Escort the doctor out," Alessandro commanded, turning back to the window. "Pay him his fee, then ensure he forgets he was ever here. If he speaks of the box, cut out his tongue." "Wait, no, I can try again," Sterling shouted as Dominic gripped his arm with a hand the size of a shovel. The door slammed shut, cutting off the plea. Silence returned to the room, heavy and suffocating. Alessandro picked up his glass of whiskey and hurled it against the fireplace. The crystal shattered with a violent crash, shards spraying across the Persian rug. "Damn it!" he roared, slamming his hands onto the desk, leaning over the black box. "What is the key, old man? What game are you playing from the grave?" In the corner of the room, a shadow moved. It was slight, hesitant, and dressed in the grey uniform of the household staff. Sophie Miller froze, her dustpan hovering inches above the floor. She had been instructed to clean the library while the meetings were taking place, provided she remained invisible. For 3 months, she had mastered the art of invisibility. She was 23, with messy brown hair tucked under a cap, and eyes that were always lowered. To the Moretti family, she was furniture. "Leave it," Alessandro snapped, noticing the movement in his peripheral vision. He didn't even look at her face. "Get out." Sophie nodded quickly, clutching her dustpan. "Yes, sir. I apologize, sir. I'll just clean the glass. I said get out." Alessandro turned, his temper fraying. Sophie flinched, her eyes darting to the black box on the desk. She hesitated. It was a fatal mistake in a house like this. "What?" Alessandro asked, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. He saw where she was looking. "You're staring at it." "No, sir, I just—" Sophie bit her lip. She shouldn't speak. She needed this job. Her sick grandmother's medical bills were piling up, and no one else paid in cash without asking questions. But the itch in her brain was unbearable. She had watched 25 men fail. She had listened to their theories, their math, their arrogance. And she had seen what they hadn't. "Speak," Alessandro commanded, stepping closer to her. He towered over her, smelling of sandalwood and danger. "The experts," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "They're trying to solve it like a math problem, like a combination lock." Alessandro laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "It is a combination lock, little Maid. That is how locks work." "No," Sophie said, looking up for the first time. Her eyes were a striking, intelligent hazel, a sharp contrast to her fearful posture. "It's not a lock. It's a story." Alessandro stared at her. For a moment he was too stunned to be angry. The audacity of this girl, this cleaner who likely didn't have a high school diploma, lecturing him on his father's masterwork. "A story," Alessandro repeated flatly. "You're wasting my time. Dominic is coming back. If you're not gone by the time he opens that door—" "Your father loved mythology, didn't he?" Sophie interrupted, stepping towards the desk. She didn't know where the courage was coming from. Perhaps the exhaustion of watching failure after failure. "I've dusted this room every day for 90 days. I've seen the books he read most. Ovid, Dante, the Greek tragedies." Alessandro's hand hovered near the concealed pistol in his waistband. "Step away from the desk." "The symbols," Sophie said, ignoring him, her eyes fixed on the box. The mechanism seemed to hum with a low frequency, something the experts had dismissed as mechanical vibration. The raven, the tower, the eye, the dagger, the rose. Dr. Sterling tried to align them based on numerical values. The expert before him, Mr. Laurent, tried to align them by historical dates. And Alessandra was intrigued despite himself. She wasn't shaking anymore. As she looked at the puzzle, her posture changed. The submissive maid vanished. In her place was someone focused, analytical. "It's the story of betrayal," Sophie murmured. She reached out a hand. Her fingers were rough from scrubbing floors, but her touch was delicate. "Don't touch it," Alessandro warned. "It has a tension trigger if you force a dial." "I won't force it," Sophie said. "You have to tell it the truth." She placed her index finger on the first dial. "The rose. It starts with love," she whispered. She spun the dial clockwise. It clicked. Not the harsh, metallic clack the experts produced, but a soft, musical ting. Alessandro stiffened. He had never heard that sound before. "Love builds the kingdom," Sophie continued. She moved to the second dial, the tower. She spun it counterclockwise, but ambition grows too high. Ting. A second musical note harmonizing with the first. Alessandro took a step closer, his breath hitching. The box was singing. "Ambition requires sacrifice," Sophie said, her voice gaining strength. She turned the third dial. The dagger. Ting. A minor third. The chord was sad, melancholic. "The sacrifice brings grief." She moved to the weeping eye. Ting. She paused at the final dial, the raven, the symbol of death, or perhaps memory. And in the end, Sophie looked at Alessandro, her gaze piercing him. Only the memory remains. The raven watches it all. She didn't spin the final dial. Instead, she pressed it inwards. The experts had spent hours spinning the raven. None of them had thought to push it. Clickis! The sound of pneumatics releasing filled the silent library. The heavy steel lid of the Pandora mechanism popped open an inch. The room was dead silent. A single minute had passed. Sophie pulled her hand back as if burned. She looked at Alessandro, suddenly realizing what she had done. She had just outsmarted the smartest man in the world and humiliated the most dangerous man in New York, in his own home. "I should go empty the trash," she squeaked, grabbing her dustpan and retreating. Alessandro didn't move. He stared at the open box. Inside, a leather-bound ledger sat waiting. He looked from the box to the retreating figure of the maid. "Stop," he commanded. Sophie froze at the door. "Sir, lock the door," Alessandro said. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. "Sir, I really need to lock the door." She turned the brass lock with a trembling hand. When she turned back, Alessandro was leaning against the desk, his arms crossed, the cold fury gone, replaced by a terrifying curiosity. "Who are you?" he asked. "And don't tell me you're Sophie the maid from Queens, because maids don't crack high-level kinetic cryptography based on Ovid's Metamorphoses." Sophie swallowed hard. "I read a lot, sir." "You read a lot," Alessandro repeated, walking slowly toward her. He stopped inches from her, trapping her against the heavy oak door. He reached out and tilted her chin up. "You have calluses on your fingers from cleaning, but you also have a callus here." He brushed his thumb against the middle finger of her right hand, where a pen or a stylus rests. And here, he touched her wrist, a faint tan line where a watch used to be. A smart watch, or perhaps a tracker. "I don't know what you mean," Sophie lied, but her pulse was visible in her neck. 25 experts failed," Alessandro whispered, his face so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You solved it in 60 seconds. You are either a witch, a genius, or a spy sent by my enemies to humiliate me before killing me. Which is it, Sophie?" Sophie pressed her back against the wood of the door, wishing she could dissolve into the grain. "I'm not a spy," she said, her voice steadying. She realized playing the terrified victim wouldn't work anymore. Alessandro Moretti didn't respect fear. He ate it. "If I were a spy, I would have waited until you were asleep to open the box and steal the ledger. I wouldn't have done it in front of your face." Alessandra paused, considering this. Valid point. "But that leaves genius or witch. And since I don't believe in magic, we are left with a mystery." He stepped back, giving her room to breathe, but his gaze pinned her in place. "Sit down." He pointed to one of the leather armchairs usually reserved for capos and consiglieres. Sophie hesitated and sat on the edge of the chair, keeping her posture rigid. "Drink." Alessandro moved to the bar, ignoring the shattered glass on the floor. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a fresh glass. "I'm on duty, sir." "You are relieved of duty. Drink." He held the glass out. Sophie took it, the crystal heavy in her hand. She didn't drink. "Tell me about the story," Alessandro said, leaning against the desk, the open black box behind him. "How did you know my father's mind better than I did?" "I didn't know his mind," Sophie said carefully. "I knew his pattern. I've been cleaning this room for 3 months. I organized the books. I noticed that 5 books were never dusty. They were taken down and put back frequently. The Sorrows of Young Werther, Macbeth, the Odyssey. All tragedies. All stories about the cost of power." Alessandro's eyes widened slightly. He looked at the bookshelf. He hadn't noticed. He had been too busy running an empire to notice which books his father read in his final days. "The symbols on the dials correspond to the themes of those books," Sophie explained. "The experts were looking for a code. I looked for a narrative. Your father was a dramatic man, wasn't he?" "He was," Alessandro murmured, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It transformed his face, making him look less like a monster and more like a man. He loved the theatrical. "Then the lock wasn't a test of intelligence," Sophie said. "It was a test of empathy. He wanted to see if the person opening it understood why he hid the money, not just where." Alessandra stared at her, a strange sensation blooming in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Admiration. "You're wasted scrubbing floors, Sophie," he said quietly. "Where did you learn to think like that?" Sophie looked down at her hands. University of Chicago. Double major in comparative literature and mathematics. "And yet," Alessandro gestured to her uniform, "you are here, cleaning up my shattered whiskey glasses for minimum wage." "Life happens," Sophie said evasively. "My father got sick. The debt was inherited. I needed money fast and off the books. Your housekeeper pays in cash." "Who was your father?" Alessandro asked. The question was sharp. Sophie stiffened. "An accountant. Nobody important. I can find out, you know. Dominic can find out what you had for breakfast on a Tuesday in 2014. His name was Robert Miller," Sophie said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "He died in prison." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Alessandro set his glass down. "Robert Miller," Alessandro repeated. "The forensic accountant who worked for the federal government, the one who was framed for embezzlement 5 years ago." Sophie's face went pale. "He wasn't framed. He made a mistake." "No," Alessandro said, walking around the desk. "He was framed by the Rossi family, my rivals." He looked at Sophie with new eyes. "You're not just a maid. You're a victim of the same war I'm fighting." Before Sophie could respond, the heavy oak door burst open. Dominic stood there, his face flushed, a rare look of panic in his eyes. He held a phone in his hand. "Boss," Dominic rumbled, glaring suspiciously at Sophie sitting in the chair. "We have a problem. A big one." "What is it?" Alessandro snapped, annoyed at the interruption just as he was unraveling the puzzle of the girl. "The perimeter sensors just went dark," Dominic said, "and we just got a text from the gatehouse. A delivery truck just rammed the main gate. It's the Russians, the Bratva." Alessandro's face hardened into stone. He looked at the open black box, then at Sophie. "They know," Alessandro swore. "They know the box is open. Someone leaked it." He grabbed the ledger from the box and shoved it into his jacket pocket. He pulled a Sig Sauer P226 from his waistband and racked the slide. "Dominic, secure the east wing. Get the men to the courtyard." "What about the girl?" Dominic gestured to Sophie, who had stood up, her eyes wide with terror. Alessandro looked at her. "If the Bratva found her here, in this room, after the box had been opened, they would torture her for information she didn't have. Or worse, they would realize she was the one who opened it and take her." "She comes with me," Alessandro said. "Boss, she's a liability," Dominic argued. "She's the only one who understands how my father thought," Alessandro said, grabbing Sophie's wrist. "And right now, this ledger is encrypted. If there's a code inside, I might need her." "I don't know how to shoot," Sophie cried, as Alessandro dragged her toward the secret panel in the bookshelf. "Then you'd better learn to run," Alessandro said, kicking the hidden latch. The bookcase swung open, revealing a dark, stone staircase. "Move, now." As they plunged into the darkness of the secret passage, the sound of automatic gunfire erupted in the main hall above them. The experts had failed. The maid had succeeded. And now they were both running for their lives. The tunnel smelled of damp earth and centuries of secrets. It was a narrow, claustrophobic passage that wound beneath the estate's manicured gardens, a relic from the Prohibition era, when the Moretti ancestors ran bootlegged liquor. Alessandro moved with the practiced ease of a predator in the dark, his hand gripping Sophie's wrist tight enough to bruise. She stumbled over uneven cobblestones, her breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed too loudly in the confined space. "Keep moving," Alessandro hissed, not looking back. The sounds of chaos, shouts, gunfire, the crash of breaking glass faded as they went deeper underground, replaced by the rhythmic drip of water and the pounding of Sophie's own heart. "My shoes," Sophie gasped, one of her cheap rubber soles slipping on the slick stone. I can't keep this pace." Alessandro stopped abruptly. The sudden halt nearly sent her crashing into his back. He turned, and in the dim light of the emergency glow sticks lining the walls, His face was a mask of irritation and adrenaline. He looked down at her feet. Without a word, he holstered his gun, bent down, and scooped her up into his arms. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, clutching his lapels. "You're slow." "I don't do slow," he grunted, breaking into a jog. He carried her as if she weighed nothing, his chest heaving rhythmically against her side. Sophie was too terrified to argue, and too shocked by the sheer physical power of the man. This was the billionaire who sat behind a desk? No, this was the animal beneath the suit. They emerged 10 minutes later into a dusty, spider-webbed garage, miles from the main house. It was hidden beneath an old abandoned mill on the edge of the property. Inside sat a single vehicle, a vintage matte black 1969 Ford Mustang. It wasn't a luxury car. It was a getaway car. Alessandro dropped her onto the passenger seat and vaulted over the hood to the driver's side. "Buckle up and hold on to something solid." The engine roared to life with a feral growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Alessandro didn't wait for the garage door to fully open. He punched the accelerator, and the Mustang scraped under the rising metal, tires spinning on the gravel as they shot out into the moonlit forest road. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. Alessandro drove with a terrifying precision, taking hairpin turns at 80 miles an hour, his eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. Sophie gripped the dashboard, her knuckles white. She watched the speedometer climb, her mind racing faster than the car. "Where are we going?" she finally whispered, the silence becoming heavier than the fear. "A place that doesn't exist," Alessandro replied, his voice tight. "My father had 3 safe houses, one in the Catskills, one in Miami, and one elsewhere. The Bratva knows about the first 2. They don't know about the Airy." "The Airy?" "It's a cabin. Off the grid, no internet, no cell service, no satellite footprint." He glanced at her, his expression softening imperceptibly. "You're shaking." "I'm a maid, Mr. Moretti. Yesterday, my biggest worry was getting a stain out of the rug. Today, I'm being chased by the Russian Mafia. Yes, I'm shaking." Alessandro reached into the back seat and tossed her a heavy wool coat. "Put it on. The heater is broken." Sophie pulled the coat around her. It smelled like him. Tobacco, expensive cologne, and gun oil. It was strangely comforting. They drove until the roads turned from asphalt to dirt, and the trees grew so thick they blotted out the moon. By the time the car crunched to a halt in front of a small A-frame cabin nestled against a cliff face, it was nearly 3 a.m. Alessandro killed the engine. The silence of the forest rushed in, deafening after the roar of the V8. "Inside, don't touch anything until I clear the room." The cabin was freezing. Alessandro lit a kerosene lamp, the yellow light illuminating a rustic interior filled with hunting gear, canned food, and a massive fireplace. He moved methodically, checking windows, checking the perimeter, his gun always leading. Sophie stood by the door, hugging herself. "Clear," he announced. He went to the fireplace and began stacking logs with efficient, angry movements. Within minutes, a fire was crackling, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. He turned to her, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his cheekbones. "The ledger, give it to me." Sophie reached into the deep pocket of her apron, where she had stashed the book during the escape. She handed it to him. Alessandro sat at the rough-hewn wooden table and opened the leather cover. He stared at the first page, then the second. Then he slammed it shut, a string of Italian curses exploding from his lips. "It's blank," he spat. "The old bastard left me a blank book." Sophie stepped closer, her curiosity overriding her fear. "Let me see." "It's empty, Sophie. Look." He shoved the book toward her. She opened it. To the naked eye, the pages were indeed creamy, high-quality paper with no ink. But Sophie ran her fingers over the page. She felt the texture. "It's not blank," she murmured. She lifted the page to the kerosene lamp, letting the light shine through the paper, rather than on it. Faint, watermark-like markings appeared. They weren't letters. They were musical staves. Notes. Invisible ink? Alessandro asked, leaning in, his shoulder brushing hers. The proximity sent a jolt of electricity through him that had nothing to do with the cold. No. Watermark weaving. It's pressed into the paper fibers during manufacturing. It's genius, Sophie breathed. You can only see it with backlighting. But it's just music, Alessandro said, frustration leaking into his voice. I don't play the piano. How does a melody give me the bank codes? Sophie studied the notes. She hummed the tune softly. It was a haunting, disjointed melody. It didn't sound like Mozart or Bach. It sounded mathematical. It's not a song, she said, her eyes widening. It's a substitution cipher, based on the chromatic scale. Do you have a pen? Alessandro patted his pockets and produced a gold fountain pen. Sophie grabbed a napkin from the table. There are 12 notes in an octave, she explained, her hand flying across the napkin. If C is 1, C sharp is 2, D is 3. Look at the intervals. A major third is 4 semitones. A perfect fifth is 7. The numbers, their coordinates. Alessandro watched her work. The firelight illuminated her face, washing out the fatigue and leaving only a fierce, intellectual beauty. He had met supermodels, heiresses, and actresses. None of them had ever looked as captivating as this girl in a dusty maid's uniform, deciphering a code that had baffled the NSA. 40, 7,128 north, 74.0060 west. Sophie read out the first line she decoded. That's New York City. Specifics, Alessandra demanded. Where in the city? She decoded the next measure of music. Bank of the Underworld? No. Wait. It translates to the Ivory Vault. Alessandro froze. The Ivory Vault. That's a myth. It's supposed to be a storage facility for the 5 families. Neutral ground. No one knows where it is. Your father knew, Sophie said, looking up, and he left the key right here. She pointed to the final measure on the page. It wasn't a note. It was a single drawn symbol. The same rose from the Pandora mechanism. We have the location, Alessandro said, his voice low. But we can't go there. The moment I step foot in the city, the Bratva will know. They have eyes everywhere. Then we need to know who is helping them, Sophie said. The Bratva couldn't have breached your estate's perimeter without an inside man. Someone disabled the sensors. Alessandro's face darkened. I trust my men. Statistics say you shouldn't, Sophie countered bravely. The probability of an external breach of a system that's sophisticated is less than 0.01%. The probability of an internal override is 85%. Alessandro looked at her, really looked at her. You're annoying, you know that? I've been told, she said, a small, tired smile touching her lips. You're also brilliant. The compliment hung in the air between them. Alessandro reached out, his hand hovering near her face. He wanted to brush a smudge of dirt from her cheek. He wanted to do a lot of things that were entirely inappropriate for a capo and a maid. Get some sleep, he said abruptly, pulling his hand back. You take the bed. I'll take the chair by the door. I can sleep on the floor, Sophie protested. You saved my empire tonight, Sophie. You get the bed. He turned away to check his weapon, missing the way Sophie looked at his back, with a mixture of fear, confusion, and a dawning, dangerous attraction. The morning sun hit the snow-covered pines outside, creating a blinding white glare that filtered through the cracks in the cabin's shutters. Sophie woke with a start, her hand instinctively reaching for a dustpan that wasn't there. She blinked, remembering the gunshots, the tunnel, the car ride. She was in a bed covered in heavy furs. Alessandro was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. Had he left her? Had he decided she was a liability after all and dumped her in the middle of nowhere? She scrambled out of bed, her feet hitting the cold wooden floor. Alessandro. The front door opened, letting in a blast of freezing air. Alessandro stepped in, carrying an armful of firewood. He looked different in the daylight. Tired, with a shadow of stubble on his jaw, his suit jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. "I thought you left," she blurted out. "I don't abandon my assets," he said, kicking the door shut, "especially the ones who can read invisible music." He dropped the wood by the fire. "There's coffee. It's instant, and it tastes like mud, but it's hot." Sophie took the tin cup he offered. "Did you sleep?" "No." He moved to the table with a ledger lay open. "I've been thinking about your math, about the traitor." He tapped the page. "I went through the next few pages while you were asleep. I couldn't read the music, but I found this." He pointed to a small marginalia, written in regular ink, tiny and cramped. It was a list of dates and initials. JK, 50K, October 4th, RS, 100 Kemptian, November 12th, VM, 2M, December 24th. "It's a payroll," Sophie said, leaning over his shoulder. "Bribes. JK is Judge Kelleher. RS is Richard Cerns, the police commissioner. We own them." "But VN?" Alessandra's voice trailed off, his jaw tightening until a muscle ticked. "VN," Sophie whispered. "Who is VN?" Alessandro didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window, staring out at the white wasteland. "Vittorio Moretti. My uncle. My consigliere." "Your uncle?" Sophie gasped. "But family?" "In this life, family is just the people most likely to stab you because they're standing close enough," Alessandro said bitterly. "Vittorio has always thought I was too young, too reckless. He wanted the seat when my father died. I thought he made peace with it." $2 million on Christmas Eve, Sophie noted. "That's a buyout. He sold the security codes to the Blattfer." Alessandro slammed his fist against the window frame. The glass rattled. "He's the only one who knew the override sequences, besides Dominic and me. If Vittorio is the rat, we are dead. He knows the safe houses. He knows—" He stopped, his eyes whitening. "He knows about the Airy?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Alessandro spun around, grabbing his jacket. "We have to go, now." "Why? You said this place was secret." "It was secret from the Bratva. It wasn't secret from the man who helped build it. If Vittorio sold me out, he sold this location too." As if on cue, a low thrumming sound vibrated through the cabin walls. It grew louder, a rhythmic thump-thump-thump that shook the dust from the ceiling rafters. "Helicopter," Alessandro shouted. He grabbed Sophie's arm and hauled her towards the back door. "Move." They burst out the back just as the front of the cabin exploded. A rocket-propelled grenade shattered the front facade, turning the heavy logs into splinters and fire. The force of the blast threw them both into the snow. Sophie screamed, her ears ringing, the world spinning in a blur of white and orange. Alessandro was over her instantly, shielding her body with his. Debris rained down on his back. Shingles, glass, burning wood. He groaned but didn't let go. "Up!" he roared, hauling her to her feet, into the trees. They scrambled up the snowy incline behind the cabin, slipping and sliding. Behind them, black SUVs were tearing up the trail, men hanging out the windows with assault rifles. The helicopter banked overhead, a sniper leaning out the side. Bullets chewed up the snow around their feet. Thwip, thwip, thwip. "There's a ridge," Alessandro panted, dragging her. "Half a mile. Caves." Sophie's lungs burned. She was a maid, not a soldier. "I can't, Alessandro, I can't." "Yes, you can." He stopped for a split second, rubbing her face in his hands. His eyes were wild, fierce. "You opened the Pandora box. You cracked the code. You are not dying in the snow, Sophie Miller. I forbid it." He kissed her. It wasn't a romantic kiss. It was a transfer of energy, a desperate seal of a promise. It was hard, fast, and tasted of blood and ash. When he pulled back, Sophie felt a surge of adrenaline that had nothing to do with fear. "Run," she whispered. They made the tree line just as the second explosion rocked the ground where they had been standing. They sprinted through the dense pine forest, the branches whipping their faces. The snow was deeper here, up to their knees, slowing them down. "They're tracking us," Alessandro said, checking his watch. "They're moving too fast. They know exactly where we are." He stopped, looking at Sophie. He patted her coat pockets. "What?" she cried. "You have a tracker on you." "I told you I don't. My uncle wouldn't send a hit squad this precise without a beacon." He ripped the wool coat off her. He checked the lining. Nothing. He checked her shoes. Nothing. Then he looked at her necklace. It was a cheap silver locket, the kind sold at drugstores. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "My grandmother gave it to me before she went into the hospital. She said a nice man from the charity gave it to her for me." Alessandro ripped it from her neck. He stomped on it with his heavy boot. The metal crunched, revealing a tiny, blinking red chip inside. "The charity," Alessandro spat. "Vittorio's front. He's been watching you. He knew you were the cleaner for the library. He knew you were smart. He probably hoped you'd open the box for him, and eventually." Sophie stared at the broken locket in the snow, horror dawning on her. She hadn't just been a bystander. She had been a pawn long before she ever stepped into the library. "Leave it." Alessandro grabbed her hand again. "They lost the signal. That buys us 5 minutes." They reached the ridge. Below them lay a sheer drop into a frozen river gorge. Across the gorge, a narrow, rickety wooden bridge swayed in the wind. "We cross," Alessandro said. "It won't hold us." Sophie argued, looking at the rotting planks. "It has to." They stepped onto the bridge. It groaned under their weight. The wind howled, swinging the structure violently. They were halfway across when Vittorio stepped out from the trees on the side they had just left. He was an older version of Alessandro, elegant, silver-haired, wearing a camel hair coat and holding a sniper rifle. "Alessandro," Vittorio called out, his voice carrying over the wind. "Don't be a fool. Give me the girl and the ledger, and you can walk away. You can go into exile. I'll let you live." Alessandro stopped in the middle of the bridge, shielding Sophie behind him. "You sold us to the Russians, uncle. You have no honor." "Honor doesn't pay the bills," Vittorio shouted. "The empire is crumbling. I made a deal to save what's left. The girl is a loose end. She knows too much." Vittorio raised the rifle. He wasn't aiming at Alessandro. He was aiming at Sophie. "No," Alessandro shouted. He didn't reach for his gun. He reached for his pocket knife. In one fluid motion, he slashed the suspension ropes of the bridge. "Hold on, Nain." He screamed to Sophie. The bridge collapsed. Sophie screamed as the floor fell out from under her. They swung down in a terrifying arc, slamming into the icy cliff face on the other side of the gorge. The impact knocked the wind out of her. She dazzled, hanging by one hand from a rotting plank, her feet dangling over the abyss. Above them, on the other side, Vittorio fired 2 shots, but the angle was too steep. He couldn't see them against the cliff wall. "Sophie," Alessandro's voice was strained. He was hanging 5 feet above her, gripping a root that protruded from the rock. "Climb, you have to climb." "I can't reach," she cried, her fingers slipping on the icy wood. "Look at me," Alessandro commanded. "Look at me." She looked up. "Trust me," he said. And then he let go of the root. He dropped, sliding down the debris of the bridge, and grabbed her waist just as her hand slipped. His momentum carried them both down, but he jammed his knife into the ice and rock, slowing their fall until they crashed onto a narrow, snow-covered ledge 20 feet down. They lay there, gasping, bruised and freezing. "You jumped," Sophie stuttered, staring at him. "I calculated the trajectory," Alessandro lied, wincing as he sat up. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead. "Come on, there's a cave entrance 10 yards back. We disappear now." As they limped into the darkness of the cave, leaving the furious shouts of Vittorio behind them, Sophie realized something. The maid and the boss were gone. In the fire and the snow, they had been forged into something else entirely. Partners. But the ledger was still encrypted. They were miles from civilization, and the most powerful crime syndicates in the world were hunting them. And Sophie had a feeling the twists were just beginning. The cave system was a labyrinth of ice and limestone, a geological scar running beneath the mountains. Alessandro and Sophie huddled together in a small alcove, protected from the biting wind, shivering violently. They had been walking for 3 hours in the dark, guided only by the faint phosphorescence of moss and Alessandro's internal compass. "We have to stop," Sophie whispered, her teeth chattering so hard the words were barely intelligible. "My legs, they won't move." Alessandro didn't argue. He slid down against the cave wall, pulling her into the V of his legs, wrapping his suit jacket, now torn and stained with blood, around both of them. He rubbed her arms vigorously, trying to generate friction heat. "You're going into hypothermia," he said, his voice rough. "Stay awake. Talk to me. Tell me the code again." Sophie blinked, her eyelashes crusted with ice. "The code is a harmonic sequence. It's not just coordinates. It's an instruction." "What instruction?" "The ivory vault isn't a building, Alessandro," she murmured, her head lolling against his chest. "I thought about the name. Ivory. Keys. It's a piano." Alessandro froze, his hands pausing on her arms. "A piano? Your father. He donated a Steinway to the St. Patrick's Cathedral Restoration Project 5 years ago. I remember reading about it in the papers. It was a custom build, the white Steinway. It sits in the choir loft." The loft, Alessandro realized. Whatever is inside that piano. "That's the vault. We have to get to the city," Sophie whispered, her eyes drifting shut. "Sophie." Alessandro shook her. "Don't sleep. Stay with me." He pressed his cheek against hers. She was terrifyingly cold. For the first time in his life, Alessandro Moretti felt true, paralyzing fear. Not for his empire, not for his money, but for this brilliant, stubborn, infuriating woman who had cleaned his floors for 3 months without him ever noticing her worth. "If we get out of this," he whispered into her hair, "I'm firing you." Sophie let out a weak, delirious laugh. "Good. The pay was terrible. I'm rehiring you as my consigliere. Double the salary. No, triple. Make it quadruple." She slurred. "And dental." "Done." Driven by a surge of desperate energy, Alessandro hauled her up. "Walk. We are walking until we find a road." It took another hour of stumbling through the dark before they saw the grey light of dawn at the cave's mouth. They emerged onto a desolate logging road. Luck, or perhaps fate, intervened in the form of an old pickup truck rattling down the mountain. Alessandro didn't wave it down. He stood in the middle of the road, looking like a spectre of death, bloodied, bruised, and dangerous. The driver, an terrified old man in a flannel shirt, slammed on the brakes. "Get out," Alessandro said. It wasn't a request. He didn't hurt the man. He handed him a wad of soggy cash from his pocket. Thousands of dollars, more than the truck was worth. "Walk to the town. Buy a warm meal. Forget you saw us." Minutes later they were speeding down the mountain, the heater blasting. Sophie sat in the passenger seat, color slowly returning to her cheeks. She looked at Alessandro, who was gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. "You gave him all your cash," she said softly. "I have billions waiting in a piano," he muttered. "Priorities." The drive to New York City was a blur of tension. They ditched the truck in the Bronx and took the subway, blending into the morning rush-hour crowd. Nobody looked twice at them. New Yorkers were used to seeing strange things. And to them, Alessandro and Sophie just looked like a couple coming home from a very bad party. They reached St. Patrick's Cathedral just as the doors were opening for tourists. The massive Gothic structure loomed over Fifth Avenue, a sanctuary of stone and glass. "The Bratva will be watching the airports, the train stations, and the banks," Alessandro whispered as they merged with a tour group. "They won't be watching a church." They slipped away from the tour and ascended the narrow, spiraling staircase to the choir loft. The air up here was still and smelled of incense and beeswax, and there, sitting in the center of the balcony, bathed in the multicolored light streaming through the rose window, was the white Steinway. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, its casing carved from bleached maple and inlaid with mother of pearl. "It's beautiful," Sophie breathed. "Focus," Alessandro said, checking the door behind them. "How do we open it?" Sophie approached the instrument. She sat on the bench. Her hands hovered over the keys. "The code in the ledger," she said. "The notes. It wasn't just a map. It's the combination." She played the first sequence. C sharp, E, G, B flat. A diminished seventh chord. The piano resonated, the sound rich and full, echoing through the empty cathedral. Nothing happened. "Try the inversion," Alessandro suggested, standing guard at the railing, watching the nave below. Sophie played it again, backwards. Still nothing. "Think, Sophie," she whispered to herself. "The raven, the tower, the story. It's not just notes, it's timing." She closed her eyes. She remembered the rhythm of the ticking clock in the library. She remembered the heartbeat of the mechanism. She began to play again, but this time she played with a specific, halting tempo, a waltz, the death waltz. As she hit the final dissonant chord, a mechanical thunk sounded from within the body of the piano. The full board, the cover over the keys, didn't lock. Instead, the music rack slid forward. Behind it, a small hidden compartment revealed itself. Inside was not a stack of cash, nor diamonds. It was a single silver USB drive and a folded piece of parchment. Alessandro grabbed the parchment. He unfolded it. It was a deed. "The deed to the Moretti estate," he read, "and transfer protocols for the offshore accounts." He looked at the USB drive. "This is the encryption key. With this, I can drain the accounts, lock out the Bratva, and bankrupt my uncle." "We did it," Sophie exhaled, slumping against the keys. A discordant sound rang out. "Yes," a voice boomed from the staircase. "You did. Very efficiently, I might add." Alessandro spun around, placing himself between Sophie and the stairs. Vittorio Moretti stood there. He wasn't alone. Behind him were three men in dark coats, silenced pistols raised, and held between two of them, beaten but alive, was Dominic. "Uncle," Alessandro said, his voice calm, betraying none of the panic he felt. "You're desecrating a house of God." "God left this family a long time ago, nephew." Vittorio smiled thinly. He walked closer, his shoes clicking on the stone floor. "I must say, I underestimated the help. The maid. Who knew?" He looked at Sophie. "Stand up, my dear. Step away from the piano." Sophie stood, her legs trembling. She clutched the side of the instrument. "Give me the drive," Vittorio commanded, extending a gloved hand. "If I give it to you," Alessandro said, holding the USB up, "you kill us." "If you don't give it to me," Vittorio nodded to his men, "I kill your loyal dog, Dominic, first. Then I shoot the girl in the knee, then the stomach, then the head, and I take the drive anyway from your corpse." Alessandro looked at Dominic. The big man's eye was swollen shut, blood dripping from his lip. Dominic shook his head slightly. "Don't do it." Alessandro looked at Sophie. Her eyes were wide, but she wasn't looking at the gun. She was looking at the piano. "The drive is encrypted," Sophie said suddenly. Her voice was loud, echoing in the loft. Vittorio turned his gaze to her. "What?" "The USB," she lied. "It has a biometric lock and a sonic trigger. It needs a password to activate the file transfer. Without it, the drive wipes itself in 10 seconds. "She's lying," Vittorio sneered. "Am I?" Sophie challenged. "Alessandro's father was a paranoid genius. You think he'd leave billions on a stick without a failsafe? You need the password." Vittorio hesitated. He knew his brother. It sounded exactly like something the old Don would do. "What is the password?" Vittorio demanded. "I don't know it," Sophie said, "but I can play it." She sat back down at the piano. "It's the second half of the song, the part that wasn't in the ledger, the part only I figured out." "Sophie, don't," Alessandro warned, playing along, his eyes locking with hers. He saw the spark there, the same spark she had when she opened the Pandora box. Let her play, Vittorio ordered, raising his gun to Alessandro's head. One wrong note, and your boyfriend loses his brains. The St. Patrick's Cathedral choir loft was deadly silent, save for the distant hum of Fifth Avenue filtering through the stained glass. Sophie sat at the white Steinway, her hands trembling over the ivory keys. This was the final gamble. Vittorio Moretti stood 10 feet away, a smug smile on his face. Behind him, 3 armed men held Dominic, who was beaten and bloody but alive. "Give me the drive," Vittorio commanded, extending a gloved hand toward Alessandro, "and I might let the girl live." "The drive is encrypted," Sophie blurted out, her voice echoing in the vast, empty nave. Vittorio turned his cold gaze to her. "What?" "It has a sonic trigger," she lied, her mind racing back to the schematics she had studied in the library. Alessandro's father didn't just hide the money, he trapped it. If I don't play the counter melody within 30 seconds of insertion, the drive wipes itself. You need me to unlock it. More. Vittorio hesitated. It sounded exactly like the kind of paranoid failsafe his late brother would design. He lowered his gun slightly, gesturing to the keyboard. "Play. But if you hit a wrong note, your boyfriend loses his brains." Sophie took a deep breath. She knew there was no sonic trigger. But she knew the white Steinway had a flaw. A high-tension bass string that had been overwound during its construction, creating a dead key on the lower octave. If struck with enough force, the tension would cause a catastrophic mechanical failure. She didn't play a melody. She slammed her hands down, creating a wall of chaotic, dissonant sound. "That's not music," Vittorio shouted, stepping closer to the piano to stop her. "Stop it!" Sophie didn't stop. She gathered every ounce of her strength and hammered the low A. Snap. The sound was like a gunshot. Inside the piano, the copper-wound bass string, under hundreds of pounds of pressure, sheared off its hitch pin. The lid of the piano exploded upward, and the razor-sharp wire whipped out, striking Vittorio across the chest and face. He screamed, clutching his eyes, staggering back blindly. "Now!" Sophie shrieked, diving to the floor. Alessandro was already moving. In the split second of confusion, he lunged at the nearest gunman, twisting the man's wrist until the bones snapped and seizing his weapon. 2 shots rang out, clean, precise hits that dropped the remaining guards. Dominic, despite his injuries, roared and threw his body weight against the last man, sending him crashing over the railing to the pews below. Silence returned to the cathedral, broken only by Vittorio's agonized groans on the floor. Alessandro stood over his uncle, his chest heaving, the stolen gun aimed at Vittorio's heart. "You underestimated the help, uncle," Alessandro said, his voice ice-cold. Vittorio looked up, blood streaming down his face. "Do it," he spat. "Kill me. The Bratva will still come for you. You can't fight a war alone." "I'm not alone," Alessandro said, looking at Sophie, who was slowly rising from behind the piano bench. She looked terrified, disheveled, and utterly magnificent. "And I'm not killing you," Alessandro continued, lowering the gun. "That's too easy. I'm giving you to the FBI." He pulled out his phone. "I'm sending the ledger to Agent Miller. The bribes, the judges you bought, the murders. You won't go to a private prison, Vittorio. You'll go to Supermax, and since you failed to pay the Russians, I imagine your time there will be short." "You can't," Vittorio whispered, horrified. "We don't talk to feds. I'm the Don," Alessandro said. "I make the rules, and the new rule is nobody touches what is mine." 2 days later, the Moretti Library was bathed in warm afternoon sunlight. The broken glass was gone, the fire was crackling, and the oppressive atmosphere of failure had vanished. Sophie stood by the window, wearing a silk dress she had tried to refuse 3 times. She looked out at the garden, no longer feeling like a ghost in the house. The door opened, and Alessandro walked in. He looked different, lighter, the weight of the hunted man gone. "The FBI took Vittorio into custody this morning," he said, pouring 2 drinks. The Bratva has retreated. They don't want a war with a man who can outsmart them and the federal government simultaneously. And my father? Sophie asked, turning to an exonerated. Alessandro smiled, handing her a glass. The ledger cleared his name. He'll be released next week. I've arranged a house soon near our house for him. Far away from here. He's safe. Sophie felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you. I should go pack. The mystery is solved. The maid can go back to being a maid. You resigned, Alessandro reminded her, stepping closer. In the cave. You demanded a promotion. I was delirious from hypothermia. I wasn't, Tian. Alessandro set his glass down on the desk, right next to the open Pandora mechanism. He took her hands in his thumbs brushing over her knuckles. I don't need a maid, Sophie. I have plenty of those. I need someone who sees the things I miss. I need a partner. A partner, Sophie breathed, and, he added softly, I think I'm falling in love with you. Which is a logistical nightmare, statistically speaking. Sophie laughed, a sound that broke the last of the tension. She reached up, placing her hand on his chest. The probability of a Mafia Don falling for his cleaner is roughly 0.0001%. Then we are defying the odds, Alessandro murmured. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a desperate kiss of survival, but a slow, deliberate promise. It was the start of a new story, one written not in code, but in trust. The experts had failed, the maid had solved it, and the boss was finally, happily, speechless. And that is how Sophie Miller went from invisible to indispensable, proving that sometimes the sharpest weapon in a war isn't a gun. It's a mind that knows how to listen. Alessandro Moretti kept his promise. Sophie never scrubbed another floor. Instead, she helped him scrub the underworld clean, becoming the most feared and respected consigliere New York had ever seen. They say behind every great man is a woman, but in the Moretti family, she wasn't behind him. She was standing right next to him, holding the keys. What would you have done if you were in Sophie's shoes? Would you have opened the box or walked away? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story of twists, codes, and dangerous romance, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.